Welcome to the Retire with Peace podcast, the podcast where we help you create a fulfilling and stress-free retirement. Each week, we bring you expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you plan and live your best retirement life. Whether you're nearing retirement or already enjoying your golden years, this podcast is here to support you every step of the way. Let's embark on this journey together and discover how to retire with peace.
Welcome back to the Retire with Peace podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dave Zaegel, and this episode is brought to you by CWOs for Hire, which is the retirement planning firm that I co-own. We are wrapping up 2024, and we are right in the middle of doing a ton of tax planning for our clients. So we're going to be accepting new clients if you're interested for a very short period of time. Then we close that window here for the end of the year, because we really have to wrap up stuff for current clients and focus especially on that. So if you're looking for help, please reach out to us soon so we can help you for the end of 2024. Otherwise, we'll open up that window again in 2025 and would be happy to help you. So today, let's talk about beating the S&P 500 index. And first of all, what that even means. And quite honestly, why it's not a great idea to focus on that too much in retirement, because you can really mess yourself up long-term doing so. So let's back up. S&P 500 is made up of 500 different stocks, and that's not always exactly the case. Sometimes it's 499, just depends on how things are going, or if somebody merged, or what all has happened within the individual stocks in that index. But generally speaking, it's an index of 500 fairly large stocks and is considered to be representative of the stock market overall. Nothing's ever a perfect representation, but with those 500 different companies, you're getting enough diversification and enough representation of the stock market to generally be considered the barometer for how the stock market is doing. And that index has been around for quite some time. So the idea behind beating the S&P 500 index fund, or index itself, is that I have a choice on where to invest my money. I can just go buy an index fund or an ETF that follows the S&P 500. I get a lot of diversification. There's very little cost in doing so, and I can have that investment very easily. So if I'm going to invest in something else, I need to be able to beat what the S&P 500 is doing. And that makes sense, because if you're not beating the S&P 500 and you're spending either a whole bunch of time or a whole bunch of money to do it, well, if that's all you're trying to do is just beat that index, then go with the low-cost ETF or index fund that's going to track the index, rather than spending a whole bunch of time or money trying to beat it on your own or with somebody else. So that's a very valid thought as you're trying to get the money to grow over time. Because if all you're trying to do is focus on the investments, if you don't really know what you're doing, you're not confident in it, it probably is easier just to take an ETF of an index like the S&P 500, put the money in, and let it grow long term. Here's the challenge with that when you get to retirement. Well, there's a couple of challenges. But one is that you don't ever want to have short-term money invested in the stock market. We've talked about this many times before, talked about it on our last episode. It's really dangerous to have that short-term money in the market, because if it's money that you need in the next couple of years, you want it to be safe and not subject to any stock market ups or downs. So that way, not only practically and mathematically does it work out better for you, it also works out better psychologically, knowing that, okay, I'm not taking the money out while the market's down. I already have it available, ready to go for me. I can leave the market alone, let it do its thing. The other challenge with trying to just keep up with the S&P 500 and beat it when you're in retirement is what's called sequence of return risk. So a lot of times you might look at what has happened, let's say over a 10-year period, and you'll say the average return for those 10 years was X. So we're just going to do a projection using that X percentage, and we're going to say for year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's the percentage we're going to use every year to forecast out the growth. Well, that's not actually how it works. And I could do a whole nother episode on average returns versus actual returns. They're two different things. And what's important to realize is that the sequence of returns actually matters a lot, especially if you are pulling money out of the stock market. So if you, for example, you could have one 10-year period where you averaged a 7% rate of return. And then you could have the next 10-year period where you averaged a 7% rate of return. And the results of those two 10-year periods can be completely different based upon how those returns happened and when money went in or out of your investments. So in the first 10 years, maybe the first 3 or 4 years were amazing. You had a bad year or two in the middle, and then the last couple were okay. But in the second block of 10 years, maybe the first 2 years were terrible. And then the next 3 to 10 years, the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those next 8 years out of that 10-year block were really good. Well, which one's going to win? And surprisingly, it's probably the first one. Simply because in the second one, those early years were terrible, and now you're trying to recover from a lower level. And it's going to be especially worse if you are pulling money out on a regular basis while those early years are down. This is especially important in the early years of retirement. We do not want to have you retire and then have the stock market take a huge hit, and you're sitting there having to pull money out of the stock market because you are trying to beat the S&P 500 or keep up with it or whatever. We have to set a proper strategy and understand that we want to have a stock portion that's going to grow similar to the S&P 500. Even if it doesn't match it or beat it, we still want to have it growing well and be able to focus on that for the long term. But we absolutely must have a bucket of short-term investments, usually in bonds, CDs, structured notes, cash. We do this all the time. We've talked about this a million times on our podcast here. We have to have that bucket there because that takes out a lot of the risk of that sequence of return, and also a lot of risk of pulling money out while the market's down. By having that short-term bucket of cash sitting there, we can let the market take a downturn when that happens. Not if, but when that happens, it can take that downturn, and we can not be pulling from it and let it recover before refilling that bucket of short-term income that we need. So super critical that in retirement, we do not want to be so focused on being all in investments and all about the stock market, because it's a really, really dangerous and in some cases catastrophic game to play. We have to have a long-term focus on that growth, but at the same time have a short-term bucket. So typically what we've seen with the clients that we are working with is on a percentage basis, that short-term bucket winds up being between 30 to 40% of somebody's total investments. So a lot of times you'll have something in the range of 70% stocks and 30% bonds or short-term funds, or maybe 60% stocks and 40% bonds and short-term funds. Those are rough numbers, but a lot of the people that we wind up working with in their situations fall into those buckets. In some cases, it might be 50-50. It could be some where it's 40% stocks, 60% bonds. Everybody's going to be a little bit different in that regard. Just depends on how much you need for income versus how much you have in retirement savings. But generally, a good place that we found with our clients to be is somewhere in that 70-30 to 60-40 range, sometimes 50-50. Again, just depends on individual situations. But again, I'm just highlighting it's so critical that yes, it's good to look for an investment like an S&P 500 for growth at a low cost, and it keeps it simple. It's a wonderful vehicle. We just can't hyper focus on that when we're in retirement because we need some extra safety as we are using it as income in retirement. Very critical concept. We talk about it all the time, having that short-term bucket of money. So if you listen to us, you're probably tired of hearing me talk about it, but it's so darn important. We want the long-term growth, and that short-term money allows us to leave the long-term growth alone and do its job and grow over the long term. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. I really appreciate your support and hope you found value in the conversation. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might benefit from it. Your feedback helps keep the show growing. Until next time, take care and stay strong as we learn